Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I have used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value for my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would from any major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list priced against the specific condition of the card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have our Mox Pearl patron Chad, piloting Falco Spara Pact Weaver. This deck uses its commander to cast cards from the top of its library to attempt wins with either Sensei's Top or Hermit Druid. Chad's opening hand contains a Polluted Delta, Vernic Catacombs, Sensei's Divining Top, Mox Diamond, Ranger Captain of Eos, Otawara Soaring City, and his London Mulligan is a Dispel. Next, we have our Mox Pearl patron Charles, piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Thrasios Triton Hero. We do not know what reality we are in, but here is the mono white guy Charles himself piloting a 4-color deck. This deck is not an ad nauseum deck. This deck uses its commanders to grind value and sets it up to play incredibly spicy lines. Charles' opening hand contains an Otawara Soaring City, Tropical Island, Elves of Deep Shadow, Mystic Remora, Archivist of Ogma, Fierce Guardianship, and a Seedborn Muse. After that we have Ryan piloting Mizzix of the Is Magnus. This is a deck that uses its commander to reduce the cost of spells and then tries to storm off for the win. Ryan's opening hand contains a Command Tower, Flooded Strand, Mana Confluence, Merchant Scroll, Brainstorm, Lotus Petal, and a Wheel of Fortune. Finally we have Drake piloting Damia, Sage of Stone. This deck uses its commander to generate advantage while trying to assemble Storm and Doomsday lines. Drake's opening hand contains a Bloodstained Mire, Overgrown Tomb, Breeding Pool, Birds of Paradise, Brainstorm, Mystic Remora, and his London Mulligan is a Marsh Flats. Without further ado, let's kick off this weebly wobbly whimsical whistle. Chad won the Whipped Cream Challenge and gets to start us off. Chad draws a card for turn and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Otawara Soaring City. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Chad passes. Charles draws and plays an Otawara Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts a Mystic Remora. Charles ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Lotus Petal. Remora triggers and Charles draws. Ryan passes to Drake. Drake draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts his own Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and Charles draws. He casts a Mana Crypt and Charles draws from Remora again. Drake passes. At the end of Drake's turn, Chad activates his top, rearranging the top 3. Chad draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Chad fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. Chad gives the turn to Charles. During his upkeep, Charles pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers, and Drake draws. He passes, discarding to hand size. Ryan draws and plays a Flooded Strand. Staring down 2 Remoras, he does nothing else and passes. During his upkeep, Drake wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it to help cast Birds of Paradise. Drake gives the turn to Chad. During his upkeep, Chad activates his top, rearranging the top 3. He draws and casts Drannith Magistrate. Ryan does everything he can to contain his contempt as Chad moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Ranger Captain. Drake takes it and Chad passes the turn. During his upkeep, Charles pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Llanowar Elves. He casts Elves of Deep Shadow. Charles passes. At the end of Charles' turn, Ryan casts Brainstorm. Both Remora's trigger and Drake and Charles draw. Then Ryan draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He then cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents into play tapped. The turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws, plays a Mana Confluence, and passes. During his upkeep, Drake loses his Mana Crypt Flip and takes 3 damage. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Elvish Mystic. He casts a Sensei's Divining Top. Remora triggers and Charles draws. Drake ships the turn to Chad. Chad draws and casts Ledger Shredder. He casts Esper Sentinel. Ledger Shredder triggers and Chad connives Spellseeker into his graveyard, giving Shredder a +1/+1 counter. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Ranger Captain and Ryan with Drannith Magistrate. They both take it and Chad gives the turn to Charles. During his upkeep, Charles pays for his Remora. He draws and taps his Elves of Deep Shadow to cast Gilded Drake. It enters and exchanges control of Chad's Ledger Shredder. He casts Noble Hierarch. Ledger Shredder triggers and Charles connives Aven Mind Sensor, giving Shredder a counter. He plays a Gemstone Caverns for turn. He casts Finehorn Elves. Charles passes. At the end of Charles' turn, Ryan casts March of Swirling Mist where X equals 2, targeting Ranger Captain and Drannith Magistrate. Remora, Sentinel, and Remora trigger and all 3 opponents draw. In response, Chad activates Sensei's Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. Then the creatures are phased out. The turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws and taps his Mana Confluence to cast his commander, Mizzix of the Is Magnus. Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Drake spends his top. During his upkeep, Drake wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also lets his Remora die. He draws and casts Recycle. Sentinel and Remora trigger and Chad and Charles draws. Drake plays a Marsh Flats. Recycle triggers and in response, Drake casts Brainstorm. Recycle, Remora, and Shredder all trigger. Charles connives Drannith Magistrate, giving Shredder a counter. He draws from Remora, and then Drake draws from Recycle. He then draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. With the other Recycle trigger still on the stack, Drake cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He then activates his Sensei's Divining Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. Then Drake draws from Recycle. Next, Drake exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Elves of Deep Shadow. Recycle triggers and Drake draws. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Recycle and Remora trigger and Charles and Drake draw. In response, Charles pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep. Sentinel triggers and Chad draws. Then Mental Misstep counters Top. Next, Drake casts Jeweled Lotus. Recycle and Remora trigger and Charles and Drake draw. With nothing else, Drake passes, discarding the hand size, which is now only 2 due to Recycle. Before Chad untaps, his creatures phase in. Chad draws and plays a Beseju, who endures as his land for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Drannith and Ranger Captain, and Drake with his Gilded Drake. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Chad casts Sensei's Divining Top. Remora triggers and Charles draws. Chad gives the turn to Charles. During his upkeep, Charles taps his Elves of Deep Shadow to help pay for his Remora. He draws and casts Silence. Everyone knows that this is trouble, and Esper Sentinel triggers. In response, Chad activates his top, rearranging the top 3. Then Chad draws. In response to Silence, Chad casts a Silence of his own. Remora triggers and Charles draws. Then both silences resolve. Now, staring at each other with nothing to do, Charles plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He passes, discarding to hand size. Ryan draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He casts Merchant Scroll, Mizzix, Sentinel, and Remora trigger. Charles and Chad draw, then Ryan gets an Experience counter. Then Ryan fetches up a Frantic Search into his hand. He taps his Mana Confluence to cast Frantic Search. Mizzix, Remora, and Ledger Shredder trigger. Charles connives Wooded Foothills, draws from Remora, and then with the Mizzix trigger still on the stack, Charles convokes Court of Calling where X equals 4. Sentinel triggers and Chad draws. In response, Drake casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Cord. Recycle, Sentinel, and Remora trigger, and all 3 draw a card. In response, Charles casts Pact of Negation, targeting Force. Ledger Shredder triggers, and Charles connives Deadly Rollick, giving Shredder a counter. With nothing else, Pact counters Force, and Cord resolves. Charles fetches up a Notion Thief onto the battlefield. Then Ryan gets an Experience counter. Then Charles draws 2 through Notion Thief, Ryan discards 2 and untaps 3 lands. Next, Ryan casts Snap, targeting Notion Thief. Remora triggers and Charles draws. In response, Charles casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Snap. With nothing else to do, Ryan passes to Drake. During his upkeep, Drake loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He skips his draw step due to Recycle. In his main phase, he casts Dress Down. Recycle and Esper trigger, he pays for Esper, and Charles draws from Recycle through Notion Thief. In response, Chad sacrifices his Ranger Captain of Eos, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Then Dress Down resolves and Drake draws a card since Notion Thief now has no abilities. Drake casts his commander, Damia, Sage of Stone, drawing from Recycle. Unfortunately locked out, Drake passes, sacrificing Dress Down. At the end of Drake's turn, Chad spends his top. Chad draws and casts Neoform, sacrificing Esper Sentinel as an additional cost. Remora triggers and Charles draws. Neoform resolves and Chad fetches up a Hermit Druid onto the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Drannith Magistrate and Charles with his Drake. Ryan blocks with Mizzix and Charles takes the hit. Chad gives the turn to Charles. During his upkeep, Charles pays for his Pact of Negation. He also lets his Remora die. He draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He plays a Mana Confluence for turn. He taps his Elves of Deep Shadow to cast Seedborn Muse. Shredder triggers and Charles connives a Mox Diamond, giving Shredder a counter. Charles casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Hermit Druid with Chad gaining 2 life. With nothing else, Charles passes. At the end of Charles' turn, Chad casts Path to Exile, targeting Seedborn. In response, Charles casts Swan Song. Swan Song counters Path, and Chad creates a 2/2 bird. Charles gives the turn to Ryan, discarding to hand size. Charles untaps with Ryan through Seedborn. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Drake loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. Also during his upkeep, Damia triggers and Charles draws 5 cards through Notion Thief. Drake skips his draw step due to Recycle. He casts Necropotence. Recycle triggers and Charles draws. Drake activates Necropotence 3 times, paying 3 life, exiling 3 cards. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Damia. In response, Charles casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. In response, Chad activates his top, rearranging the top 3. Still in response, Drake activates Necropotence twice, paying 2 life, exiling 2 more cards. Still in response, Charles casts Abrupt Decay. Shredder triggers and Charles connives an Undergrowth Stadium. Then Mana Crypt is destroyed. Then Rift resolves, bouncing all of Charles' opponent's non-land permanents. Next, Drake taps his City of Brass to cast Birds of Paradise. Drake moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes, discarding to hand size, putting Damia into the command zone. Charles untaps with Chad through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Chad casts Turn the Earth, shuffling Ranger Captain and 2 lands into his library, gaining 2 life. He draws and casts Drannith Magistrate. Chad passes. At the end of Chad's turn, Charles casts Vampiric Tutor. In response, Drake pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Tutor. In response, Charles casts Veil of Summer. Shredder triggers and Charles connives Demonic Consultation, giving Shredder a counter. Then Veil resolves, Charles draws, then Misstep fizzles. Then Charles fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then Chad passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Charles loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle for turn. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Elvish Mystic. He casts Wishclaw Talisman. In response, Chad casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Wishclaw. In response, Charles casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Force. Offer counters Force, Chad creates 2 treasures, and Wishclaw Talisman resolves. Charles activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Drake. He casts a Gilded Drake. It enters and exchanges control of Chad's Drannith. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He casts Emrakul, the Promised End. Emrakul triggers, targeting Drake. Then Emrakul resolves, and Charles moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Seedborn, Ledger Shredder, 2 Elves, and a Notion Thief. Ryan takes it, and Charles ships the turn to Ryan. Charles untaps with Ryan. Ryan draws, and still being locked out by Drannith and Notion Thief, takes no actions and passes the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Charles activates Thrasios 5 times. He scries and reveals a Force of Negation into his hand, a Polluted Delta onto the battlefield tapped, a Demonic Tutor into his hand, an Imperial Seal into his hand, and finally a Thran Quarry into play tapped. The turn moves to Drake. I mean, it's technically Charles, but it's Drake's turn. But Charles could... You know what? Let's just move to the next turn. Charles untaps with Drake, quote unquote. Charles, cosplaying as Drake, draws for turn. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Phyrexian Tower. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. Shredder triggers, and Charles connives Exotic Orchard. Charles has Drake activate his Wishclaw Talisman, fetching up a Noxious Revival into his hand and giving Wishclaw back to Charles. He casts Elvish Mystic. He casts Deathrite Shaman. Charles has Drake channel Ottawara, Soaring City, bouncing Emrakul back to Charles' hand. Charles has Drake move through phases, and Charles responds by casting Chain of Vapor, targeting his Mana Crypt. Crypt bounces, he sacks a land, targeting Drake's Mox Diamond. Diamond bounces, and Charles has Drake sack a land, continuing the chain, bouncing his Birds of Paradise. He makes him sack a land, continue the chain, tapping his City of Brass for mana, bouncing Elvish Mystic. He makes him sack a land, continue the chain, targeting Deathrite Shaman. In response, Charles has Drake pay 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, putting Ottawara back on top of Charles' library. Then Deathrite bounces, Charles makes Drake sack a land, continuing the chain, targeting Charles' Wishclaw Talisman. Wishclaw bounces, and Charles stops the chain. All through, and completely annihilated, Charles passes to Drake's extra turn. Drake draws, takes no actions, and passes. Charles untaps with Chad. Chad draws and casts Sensei's Divining Top. He casts Jiraga Tree Speaker. Shredder triggers, and Charles connives Avacyn's Pilgrim, giving Shredder a counter. He casts Memory's Journey, shuffling Ottawara, Soaring City, Turn the Earth, and Silence back into his library. Chad ends his turn. At the end of Chad's turn, Charles cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He activates Thrasios 3 times, scrying and revealing a Scalding Tarn into play tapped, Sheoldred the Apocalypse into his hand, and a Morphic Pool into play tapped. The turn moves to Charles. Charles draws and casts Mana Crypt. He cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He recasts Emrakul, the Promised End. It triggers and targets Chad. Shredder triggers, and Charles connives Imperial Seal, giving Shredder a counter. He casts Bloom Tender. He casts Sheoldred the Apocalypse. He casts Wishclaw Talisman. He activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Chad. He casts Smothering Tide. He taps his Elves of Deep Shadow to cast Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. He plays a Cephalid Coliseum for turn. Charles passes the turn to Ryan. Charles untaps with Ryan. Ryan draws, Shieldred triggers, and Ryan loses 2 life. He does nothing else and passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Charles activates Thrasios 3 times, scrying and revealing a Mystical Tutor, drawing it and gaining 2 life through Shieldred, a City of Brass into play tapped, and a Thassa's Oracle, drawing it and gaining 2 from Shieldred. The turn moves to Drake. Charles untaps with Drake. Drake draws, Shieldred and Tithe trigger, Charles creates a treasure, and Drake loses 2 life. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Birds of Paradise. Drake ends his turn. At the end of Drake's turn, Chad casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Silence onto the top of his library. Chad, controlled by Charles, untaps and draws. Shieldred and Tithe trigger, Charles creates a treasure, and Chad loses 2 life. Charles has Chad activate Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Charles. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Thought Lash. He activates Thought Lash over and over, exiling his entire library. Charles has Chad activate his top. Charles responds by channeling Otawara, Soaring City, bouncing his own Notion Thief back to his hand. Then Top's ability resolves, Chad attempts to draw from an empty library and loses the game. The turn moves to Charles. Charles draws, Shieldred triggers, and Charles gains 2 life. In his main phase, Charles casts Peer into the Abyss, targeting Ryan. Ryan draws half of the cards in his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. Shieldred triggers and loses 2 life from every draw. Then Ryan dies. Charles moves to combat and attacks Drake with Emrakul. Drake takes it, dies, and Charles wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what an unbelievable game tonight. People repeatedly tell us online that CEDH games lack any sort of splashy plays that people love seeing on the casual side of this format. Tonight's game showed that there is still plenty of room for those approaches to those who are willing to give them a try. Congrats to Charles on his win. We could have sworn it was not our normal beloved Charles, as he was actually playing good colors tonight. Just kidding. In all seriousness, Charles was a master of his deck, and he completely annihilated everyone at the table. From controlling the actions on the board to just running away with the game, there was hardly a time when Charles wasn't in full control of tonight's game. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time and we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.